Canadian River Breaks, a cowboy's gift. At a cowboy church in northeast New Mexico, a young cowboy preacher said, "Before I begin, I want to introduce you to an old friend." An elderly cowboy stepped up to the pulpit and began to speak. He said, "I want to tell you a story. There were 3 cowboys, a father, his teenage son, and his son's best friend. Now they were helping with the fall branding near the Canadian River Breaks country in New Mexico. They were helping a bunch of cowboys gather and drag calves to the fire. Now the father was a good hand with a rope. After they had finished, all of the other cowboys left. The father and the 2 boys stayed to finish up. When they were done, it was late, and they headed for home. Now they had to cross the Canadian River to get home. They had crossed this river hundreds of times. The river was rising, and it can turn into a torrent in seconds from the rain up in the mountains. Well, they began to cross the river, and you guessed it, the river got real ugly about the time they were in the middle. The current and undertow swept all 3 away, and the teenage boys got separated from their horses. The father managed to hang on to his saddle horn and get across. Now remember, the father was an experienced hand and good with the rope. As the old cowboy was telling his story, he hesitated for a moment. He made eye contact with 2 young cowboys who were, for the first time since the service began, interested in his story. The old cowboy continued. The father grabbed a rope from his saddle. The 2 young cowboys were being swept away fast. The father had to make the most excruciating decision of his life. To which boy would he throw the rope? The father had only seconds to make his decision. The father knew that his son was a good Christian and solid in his faith, and he also knew that his son's best friend was not a Christian. The father yelled out, "I love you, son!" Then he threw the rope to his son's best friend. By the time he pulled the friend to the river bank, his son had disappeared in the raging river, and his body was never recovered. By this time, the 2 young cowboys in church were sitting up straight in the pew, anxiously waiting for the next words to come out of the old cowboy's mouth. The old cowboy continued. He knew his son would step into eternity with Jesus, and he could not bear the thought of his son's best friend stepping into eternity without Jesus. Therefore, he sacrificed his son to save his son's best friend. He said, "How great is the love of God that he should do the same for us. Our Heavenly Father sacrificed his only begotten Son that we could be saved. I urge you to accept his offer to rescue you and take a hold of the lifeline he is throwing out to you." With that, the old cowboy turned and sat back down in his chair as silence filled the room. Within minutes after the service ended, the 2 young cowboys were at the old cowboy's side. That was a nice story, but I don't think it was very realistic for a father to give up his only son's life in hopes that the other boy would become a Christian. "Well, you've got a point there, son," the old cowboy replied, glancing down at his worn Bible. Then a big smile lit up his face. Once again, he looked up under the brim of his worn cowboy hat at the 2 young cowboys and said, "It sure isn't very realistic, is it? But I'm standing here today to tell you that this story gives me a glimpse of what it must have been like for God to give up his son for me. You see, I was that cowboy, and your pastor was my son's best friend. Now I know someday my son, your pastor, and I will ride together again.